If you've been sitting on the fence around the Melbourne property market like so many Australian investors, then in this video, I'm gonna bring 10 of the most important or fundamental reasons why Melbourne not just has incredible upside over the next 15 years, but is actually Australia's most undervalued capital city in 2025. Now, according to Comparative, Melbourne was the worst performing capital city market in all of Australia in the last 12 months. On top of this, it's had an absolute shocker in the last 3 years, 5 years and 8 years after COVID. In fact, I bought a property this morning for one of our clients that was literally cheaper to buy in 2025 than the owner bought it for in 2018. Now, the first reason I like Melbourne and the reason I can see so clearly through the short-term pain and the short-term horrible performance in the Melbourne property market is when I take a bigger view and look at the longer-term history. In fact, according to homely.com.au, between 1970 and 2016, the Melbourne property market, when you look at the total return divided by that 46-year period, did an average of 9.5% per annum. Now, the second reason I love Melbourne is when we look at the 30-year history, Melbourne was actually the #1 performing capital city market, doing over 459% in the 30 years leading up to 2022. Now, not only is that absolutely insane, but we're talking about an average of 150% growth per decade. Now, the third reason I love Melbourne is when I looked at an article recently from Comparative, one of Australia's largest data providers. It looked at the difference between the Sydney and the Melbourne property markets over the last 30 years. Now, historically, Sydney has always been the stronger market, on average being worth about 29% more than Melbourne. But right now, for the first time in 30 years, the difference between Sydney and Melbourne is almost 60%, which says to me that Melbourne could actually look the best fundamentally on paper than it has at any point as a buyer relative to Sydney in the last 30 years today. Now, the fourth reason is, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, a whole bunch of people in the last 3 years have been choosing Melbourne as their destination of choice when they're coming into the country. In fact, over 160,000 people per year have been moving into the Melbourne market for the last 3 years, and Melbourne is actually expected, according to the ABS, to grow by 160,000 people a year for the next 5 years, taking the city to almost 7 million people just 5 years from today. Now, the fifth reason is based on another article I just read from the Australian Financial Review, which is expecting Melbourne to be the current size of London in just 24 years from today. Now, as a business, we work with investors from all over the country as well as all over the world, and particularly talking to my South American, Asian and Indian clients, when they're talking to their friends back home about which market they should come in and move into in Australia, their preference at the moment has changed from Sydney to Melbourne. Now, if you think about this logically, if you're coming into the country with somewhere between a 100 and 300 grand a year combined annual salary, and you can move into somewhere like the Sutherland Shire or the Hills District of Sydney for between 1.2 and 1.8 million dollars, or you can move into the Melbourne market where you can earn the same money, but you can buy homes for 550 to 750K. That is why so many more first-generation Australians are moving into the Melbourne market at the moment. Now, the sixth, and I think the most important reason why Melbourne is being undervalued at the moment is because it got absolutely brutalized and hurt during the COVID period. Not only did the government down there impose some of the most severe lockdown penalties and policies in the entire world, but over 300,000 people during that COVID period decided to bail Melbourne and move up here to Queensland or over there to Perth. Now, that created a whole bunch of issues, including much higher vacancy rates, heaps of extra properties where nobody wanted to live, a state government that was almost bankrupt, and just more than anything, a really, really bad taste in the average person living down there or the average person in Australia thinking about moving to Melbourne. And I believe that hangover is still very, very much a real reality, which is part of the reason for the underperformance of the Melbourne market relative to places like Perth, Brisbane, Adelaide, Hobart, Canberra and Sydney from COVID until today. Now, all of those things would be important if we were talking about a major regional town, but with 160,000 people a year moving into the Melbourne market, and Melbourne being one of the top 10 most livable cities and one of the top 5 most valued cities in the world for international education, it's only a matter of time before people recognize the affordability of the market, rents go up, vacancy rates continue to come down, and we see a positive shift in the Melbourne market. Now, the seventh indicator that I love about Melbourne right now is watching vacancy rates over time. Now, what we know from CBA's data is when vacancy rates are below 2%, it means that the market is chronically undersupplied. Now, I've watched Melbourne since COVID go from 6%, 5%, 4% to 1.8% vacancy rates as of the time of recording this video. Now, with more and more people moving back to Melbourne from around Australia, plus from overseas, and there not being enough property being built down there at the moment, we're getting to the point where we'll start to see the perfect storm. Now, another reason I love Melbourne at the moment is it is so affordable when you compare it to Sydney or Brisbane right now. Now, this is the first time in over 16 years that I've been personally investing where I've seen the difference between land prices in Brisbane and Melbourne being somewhere between $150,000 and $300,000 cheaper in Melbourne than Brisbane, let alone Sydney right now. Now, from my research, having looked at over 500 suburbs in the Melbourne market, you can get houses right now that would sell for between $1.2 and $1.8 million in Sydney for somewhere between $550 and $750K in Melbourne. Now, the ninth reason I love Melbourne at the moment is when I look at the 3-year growth rates. So let's say we're looking at the 3-year growth rates of Melbourne versus, say, Adelaide, Perth, and Brisbane right now. Now, in the last 3 years, the average suburb that we like in Melbourne has done between -15 and +15% in the last 3 years. Then if I compare that to similar suburbs in the likes of Perth, Adelaide, and Brisbane in the last 3 years, similar suburbs have done somewhere between 40 to as much as 85% growth in the last 3 years. Now, when we look at a similar story over the last 12 months, again, most of the suburbs I like in Melbourne from my research have done between -5 and +5%. Now, when we compare that to similar suburbs in Perth, Adelaide, and Brizzy, most of those quality suburbs have done somewhere between 10 to as much as 25% growth in the last 12 months. I think now more than ever, it is super, super important to get your head around the fundamentals of the Melbourne market. Start looking at the differences between the really expensive sides of the city, like East Melbourne down through the Mornington Peninsula, versus some of the northern, western, and southwestern suburbs in Melbourne, because there really is a tale of two cities at the moment in Melbourne. There is what has absolutely gone ballistic in the last 10 years, and then there's this entire shadow side of the city with some of the suburbs in the past that haven't performed as well, that people have written off because they're a little bit further from the CBD, or because in the past they had poor brand names that are so undervalued right now, and you'll see what I mean 7 to 15 years from the date of recording this video. G'day guys, my name's Ben and I'm the director here at Pumped on Property, and I just want to say a massive thank you for watching our content today. Now, if you're thinking about buying an investment property in the next 3 to 12 months, then the team and I would love to offer you a one-on-one strategy session. In that session, we can talk about exactly where you are right now, where you'd like to be longer term, and we can deeply educate you on the Australian market. And then you can take that information and go and absolutely smash it on your own, or potentially become one of the small number of clients that we work with each week. To book your session, all you have to do is go to www.pumpedonproperty.com and click that book your free strategy session button. But either way, we wish you all the best on your journey as an investor to financial freedom.